The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time of great change and upheaval in Europe. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled and new kingdoms rose from its ashes, the world was reshaped by shifting borders, languages, and beliefs. It was a time of castles and crusades, of plagues and superstitions, of faith and fear. Against this tumultuous backdrop, the mentally ill occupied a precarious position in society. Their condition was little understood, shrouded in mystery and stigma. To many, they were figures of fascination and revulsion, their minds seemingly touched by forces beyond the realm of reason. In the early medieval period, the prevailing belief was that mental illness was a spiritual affliction rather than a physical one. Those who displayed strange behaviors or unconventional thoughts were often seen as being possessed by demons or punished by God for their sins. The treatment of the mentally ill, therefore, largely fell to the clergy and religious orders. One such figure was St. Dymphna, a 7th century Irish princess who would become the patron saint of the mentally ill. According to legend, Dymphna was a devout Christian who had taken a vow of chastity. After the death of her mother, her father, a pagan king, was driven mad by grief and became fixated on marrying his own daughter. Dymphna fled to Belgium with her confessor, but her father tracked them down and, in a fit of rage, beheaded the priest. When Dymphna refused to return with him, he drew his sword and struck off her head as well. She was only 15 years old. The site of Dymphna's martyrdom became a shrine and a place of pilgrimage for those seeking relief from mental afflictions. Her story, though tragic, speaks to the deep-seated belief in the Middle Ages that mental illness was a battle between good and evil, a trial of the soul. Treatment during this time was a reflection of these spiritual beliefs. The mentally ill were often taken to religious sites, such as St. Dymphna's shrine, in the hopes that prayer, holy water, or the intercession of saints would cure them of their supposed demonic possession. Exorcisms, too, were a common recourse, with priests attempting to drive out the evil spirits through ritual and invocation. However, as the Middle Ages progressed, glimmers of a different understanding began to emerge. In the 11th century, the Persian physician Avicenna proposed that melancholia, a condition characterized by deep sadness and listlessness, was caused by an imbalance of the humors, specifically an excess of black bile. This idea that mental illness could have a physical, biological basis was a radical departure from the purely spiritual view that had held sway for centuries. Avicenna's works, along with those of other ancient physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, would help to sow the seeds of a medical model of mental illness. But change was slow to take root in the medieval mind. Even as some scholars and physicians began to explore natural explanations for mental afflictions, the belief in supernatural causes remained widespread. This tension between the spiritual and the scientific would shape the perception and treatment of the mentally ill for centuries to come. As we move into the High Middle Ages, we see this dichotomy play out in the lives of individuals who are both revered and reviled for their unconventional minds. One such figure was Margery Kempe, an English Christian mystic who lived in the 15th century. Kempe was a mother of 14 children who, after the birth of her first child, began to experience vivid religious visions and a calling to live a life of devotion. She embarked on pilgrimages, engaged in ecstatic public displays of worship, and dictated what is considered the first autobiography in the English language. To some of her contemporaries, Kempe was a holy woman, blessed with divine visions and a special connection to God. But to others, her behavior was seen as disruptive, even heretical. She was accused of being possessed by demons, and her sanity was called into question. Modern scholars have suggested that Kempe may have been suffering from postpartum psychosis or bipolar disorder, conditions that were little understood in the Middle Ages. Her story illustrates how the line between divine inspiration and mental illness was often blurred, and how those who straddled that line could be both celebrated and condemned. As the medieval period progressed, the treatment of the mentally ill took on a more institutional character. Leprosaria and pest houses, originally established to quarantine those with leprosy and other contagious diseases, began to house the mentally ill as well. These makeshift asylums were grim places, more akin to prisons than hospitals. Patients were often chained, caged or beaten, left to languish in filth and squalor. There was little in the way of therapeutic intervention. The goal was simply to remove the mentally ill from society and contain the perceived threat they posed. It's a bleak picture, one that speaks to the fear and misunderstanding that surrounded mental illness in the medieval world. But even in the darkest of times, there were glimmers of light, individuals who challenged the prevailing notions of their age and fought for a more compassionate understanding of the mind. As we move into the late Middle Ages, we'll encounter some of these extraordinary figures and explore how their stories intersected with the tumultuous events of their time. The witch hunts that swept across Europe, the rise of the first asylums, and the dawning of a new age of scientific inquiry. All of these would shape the course of how the mentally ill were seen and treated. But for now, dear listener, let us pause and reflect on the journey we've undertaken so far. From the spiritual lens of the early medieval period to the nascent medical model of the High Middle Ages, we've traced the shifting perceptions of mental illness through the centuries. It's a complex and often troubling history, one that reminds us of the deep-seated stigma and misunderstanding that has long surrounded the mentally ill. But it's also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the brave souls who fought against the tide of superstition and fear to bring light to the darkness. As we continue our exploration, I invite you to ponder these themes and to consider how far we've come in our understanding of the mind and how far we still have to go. The road to compassion and enlightenment is a long one, but it's a journey we must undertake if we are to build a world that truly values and supports those who suffer from mental illness. And so, as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through the corridors of history, illuminated by the stories of those who came before. Their triumphs and their struggles, their wisdom and their folly, all of it is a part of the tapestry of human experience, woven through the ages. Rest well, dear listener, and join me again next time as we delve deeper into the annals of the medieval mind. Until then, may your dreams be gentle and your spirit be at peace. Good night. As the Black Death decimated Europe in the 14th century, fear and superstition gripped the populace. In their desperate search for someone to blame, the mentally ill were caught in the crossfire, accused of being in league with the devil himself. It was a perilous time to display any unconventional behavior. One victim of this hysteria was Joan of Arc, the young French peasant girl turned military leader. Born around 1412 in Domremy, France, Joan reported experiencing visions and hearing voices from the age of 13. These voices, which she believed belonged to saints, compelled her to support Charles VII in the fight against English domination during the 100 Years' War. With dogged persistence, Joan eventually gained an audience with the Dauphin, heir to the throne, and convinced him to allow her to lead French troops into battle, dressed in male attire. To the astonishment of many, this teenage girl helped turn the tide of the war, lifting the siege of Orléans in just 9 days and paving the way for Charles VII's coronation. But Joan's stunning rise was followed by a precipitous fall. In 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English, and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. Her unusual behavior and claims of divine guidance were used as evidence against her. The trial record paints a picture of a frightened 19-year-old, yet one who staunchly defended her convictions. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, Joan boldly replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Despite her consistent testimony, Joan was convicted and sentenced to burn at the stake. On May 30th, 1431, she was tied to a tall pillar in the Vieux Marché in Rouen, the wood bundles lit beneath her feet. It is said she asked to hold a crucifix as the flames consumed her. Her ashes were scattered in the Seine River. 25 years after her execution, an inquisitorial court authorized by Pope Calixtus III re-examined the original trial, debunking the charges against her. Joan was eventually beatified in 1909 and canonized as a saint in 1920. While celebrated as a French national heroine and venerated by the Catholic Church, some modern scholars believe Joan may have experienced schizophrenia or a similar condition that gave rise to her visions and voices. Joan of Arc's story is a poignant reminder of how the mentally ill were misunderstood, vilified, and all too often met with a tragic end in medieval times. Her experiences, though extraordinary, were emblematic of a larger pattern of persecution. Across the Channel, England's Bethlehem Royal Hospital, infamously known as Bedlam, was perhaps the most notorious asylum of the late medieval period. Founded in 1247 as a priory, it began to specialize in housing the mentally ill in the late 14th century. Initially, Bedlam accommodated only a handful of inmates, but by the 15th century, it had gained a reputation as a place of last resort for the mad. Life inside Bedlam was a far cry from the therapeutic environment we associate with modern psychiatric facilities. Inmates were considered little better than animals, chained to the walls, left to lie in their own filth. The noise was said to be unbearable, with patients screaming, cursing, and clanging their chains day and night. Rather than being treated with compassion, Bedlam's residents were viewed as a source of entertainment. For a penny, curious Londoners could peer into their cells, laugh at their antics, and even poke them with sticks to elicit a reaction. This macabre practice wasn't outlawed until 1770. The dehumanizing conditions at Bedlam were symptomatic of a society that had little understanding of or empathy for those with mental disorders. Asylums of the era functioned more as prisons than hospitals, places to segregate the mad from the rest of society rather than treat them. But even as the medieval period drew to a close, winds of change were starting to blow. The Renaissance, with its renewed interest in classical learning and scientific inquiry, brought a gradual shift in how mental illness was perceived and treated. Scholars began to dust off the works of ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, who had emphasized natural rather than supernatural explanations for mental disorders. Though their theories, based on the balance of bodily humors, may seem primitive by today's standards, they represented a crucial step away from demonological thinking. One influential figure of this transitional era was Robert Burton, an English scholar and Anglican clergyman. In his masterwork, The Anatomy of Melancholy, published in 1621, Burton drew on everything from ancient philosophy to contemporary medicine to explore the causes, symptoms, and treatments of what we would now call depression. Burton described melancholy as a kind of dotage without a fever, having for his ordinary companions fear and sadness without any apparent occasion. He proposed that it could be caused by a range of factors, from poor diet and lack of exercise to heartbreak and grief. His recommended treatments included a healthy lifestyle, good company, travel, and even music therapy. While Burton's understanding of melancholy was still rooted in the humoral theory, his work represented a growing recognition that mental disturbances had natural causes and could potentially be alleviated through natural means. It was a small but significant step on the long road to a more enlightened view of mental illness. But that road would be a winding one, with many setbacks and detours along the way. Even as scientific understanding advanced, superstition and stigma continued to shape the lives of the mentally ill. The story of Saint Teresa of Avila, the 16th century Spanish mystic, illustrates this dichotomy. Born into a noble family in 1515, Teresa was a precocious and imaginative child. At the age of 7, she ran away from home with her brother, intending to travel to Morocco to be martyred for her faith. As an adult, Teresa entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation in Avila, where she began to experience intense spiritual visions and moments of ecstasy. In one famous episode, she described feeling her heart pierced by a golden lance, a sensation of both exquisite pain and supreme joy. Teresa went on to become a prominent figure in the Catholic Reformation, founding numerous convents and writing influential works on prayer and mystical theology. She was canonized in 1622 and later named a Doctor of the Church, a title reserved for saints whose writings are deemed to be of universal importance. Yet some modern researchers have suggested that Teresa's ecstatic experiences may have been a result of temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition that can produce vivid hallucinations and feelings of intense religious significance. While it's impossible to make a definitive diagnosis centuries after the fact, Teresa's own descriptions of her visions, as well as the migraines and periods of unconsciousness she experienced, are consistent with the symptoms of this disorder. Teresa's story underscores how, even as the Renaissance ushered in a new era of scientific inquiry, the boundary between mystical experience and mental disturbance remained blurred. For every Robert Burton seeking natural explanations for melancholy, there were countless others who still saw madness as a sign of either divine inspiration or demonic possession. And for those deemed mad, the consequences could be dire. While Teresa was celebrated as a saint, countless other mentally ill individuals languished in squalid asylums or faced persecution as witches and heretics. The horrors of Bedlam and other early asylums would persist for centuries, even as the philosophical tides slowly shifted. It would take the sustained efforts of reformers like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England, who pioneered more humane methods of treatment in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, to begin to chip away at the brutal practices of the past. And yet, echoes of medieval attitudes towards mental illness can still be heard today. The stigma and discrimination faced by those with mental disorders, while not as overt as in Joan of Arc's time, remain pervasive. Many countries still struggle to provide adequate resources for mental health care, leaving the most vulnerable to fend for themselves. As we reflect on the plight of the mentally ill across the ages, it's clear that we've come a long way from the days of Bedlam. But it's equally clear that we still have a long way to go. The story of how the mentally ill were treated in medieval times is, in many ways, a story of fear and misunderstanding triumphing over compassion and reason. It's a sobering reminder of the cruelty that can result when we allow stigma and superstition to guide our actions. But it's also a story of resilience, of individuals like Joan of Arc and Saint Teresa, who managed to make their mark on history despite the challenges they faced. And it's a story of slow but steady progress, of the gradual shift from supernatural to natural explanations, from punishment to treatment. As we continue to write the next chapters of this story, let us draw lessons from the past. Let us strive to replace fear with understanding, stigma with empathy. Let us remember that those who suffer from mental illness are not possessed by demons or touched by the devil, but are human beings deserving of respect, care, and dignity. The road ahead may be long, but every step takes us further from the dark days of Bedlam and closer to a future where no one has to suffer in silence, where mental health is treated with the same urgency and compassion as physical health. It's a future worth fighting for, not just for the sake of those who struggle with mental illness, but for the sake of our shared humanity. Because in the end, the measure of a society is not how it treats its most fortunate, but how it treats its most vulnerable. As we close this chapter on the history of mental illness in medieval times, let us carry forward the lessons learned, the progress made, and the work still to be done. Let us build a world where the Joans and Teresas of tomorrow are not met with persecution and misunderstanding, but with the help and support they need to thrive. It's a task that will require the efforts of us all, researchers and doctors, policymakers and advocates, friends and family members. But it's a task worth undertaking for the sake of all those who have suffered in silence across the centuries, and for the sake of the better, kinder, more enlightened world we know is possible. So let us take up this challenge with renewed dedication, armed with the knowledge of where we've been and the vision of where we need to go. The road may be long, but every journey begins with a single step. Let us take that step together and keep walking until the job is done. As the 16th century dawned, the spirit of the Renaissance was spreading across Europe, heralding an age of rebirth and renewed interest in the arts, sciences, and medicine. Yet for the mentally ill, the light of this new era was slow to illuminate the dark crevices of ignorance and superstition that had long shrouded their condition. In the grand halls of academia, scholars were rediscovering the ancient works of Hippocrates and Galen, dusting off tomes that had lain neglected for centuries. These Greek and Roman physicians had proposed natural explanations for mental illness, attributing it to imbalances of bodily humours rather than supernatural forces. It was a tantalizing glimpse of a more enlightened approach, a whisper of hope amidst the prevailing din of demonology. One man who heard that whisper was Robert Burton, a 17th century English scholar and clergyman. In 1621, he published a landmark treatise titled The Anatomy of Melancholy, in which he argued that melancholia, what we now call depression, was a medical condition, not a spiritual affliction. With meticulous detail, Burton catalogued the symptoms, causes, and potential treatments for this disease of the soul, drawing upon the wisdom of ancient physicians and contemporary observations alike. Burton's work was groundbreaking in its systematic approach to mental illness, but it was not without its limitations. Like many of his contemporaries, he still believed that astrology and the alignment of celestial bodies could influence the mind and body, and his proposed remedies, while well-intentioned, were often more amusing than effective. He recommended everything from herbal concoctions to bloodletting to copious amounts of wine as potential cures for melancholy. But perhaps Burton's greatest contribution was simply in starting a conversation, in daring to suggest that the mentally ill deserved compassion and care rather than condemnation and confinement. It was a radical notion in an age when madness was still widely viewed as a mark of moral failing or demonic possession. Alas, for most of the mentally ill in the 16th and 17th centuries, Burton's ideas were little more than an intellectual curiosity, a glimmer of enlightenment that scarcely penetrated the gloom of their daily existence. For them, the Renaissance was a distant drumbeat, a march of progress that left them behind in the shadows of superstition and squalor. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the asylums and madhouses that dotted the European landscape. These institutions, ostensibly founded to care for the mentally ill, were often little more than human warehouses, where the unfortunate and the unwanted were left to languish in filth and despair. The most notorious of these asylums was Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, better known by its nickname Bedlam. Founded in the 13th century as a priory, Bedlam had by the 16th century become a repository for the mentally ill, a place where the manic and the melancholic mingled with the poor and the criminal. Conditions at Bedlam were appalling. Patients, many of them naked and chained to the walls, slept on straw mats crawling with vermin. They were regularly beaten and abused by the staff, who saw them as little more than animals to be subdued and contained. Wealthy patrons would come to gawk at the inmates as a form of morbid entertainment, marveling at their strange antics and incoherent ravings. It was a bleak picture, a stark reminder of how far the reality of mental health care lagged behind the lofty ideals of the Renaissance thinkers. While scholars debated the nature of the mind and the soul, the mentally ill continued to suffer in silence, their cries echoing unheard through the stone halls of Bedlam. But even in this dark chapter of history, there were flickers of light, brief moments of grace that pierced the gloom. One such moment came in the story of Saint Teresa of Avila, a 16th century Spanish mystic and nun who experienced vivid spiritual visions throughout her life. Teresa was born into a noble family in 1515, and from a young age she was drawn to the contemplative life of the convent. But her early years as a nun were marked by illness and inner turmoil, as she struggled with feelings of unworthiness and a sense of spiritual dryness. It was during this time that Teresa began to experience a series of ecstatic visions in which she claimed to see and communicate with Christ and various saints. These visions were often accompanied by physical sensations of pain and pleasure, as well as moments of spiritual rapture that left her in a state of euphoric bliss. To the modern eye, Teresa's experiences bear many of the hallmarks of temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition that can produce intense spiritual and mystical experiences. But in her own time, Teresa's visions were seen as a sign of divine favor, a confirmation of her holiness and spiritual purity. Teresa went on to become one of the most influential figures in the Catholic Church, founding several convents and writing extensively on the spiritual life. Her autobiography, The Life of Teresa of Jesus, remains a classic of mystical literature, offering a glimpse into the inner world of a woman who lived in constant communion with the divine. But for all her spiritual gifts, Teresa was not immune to the prejudices and suspicions of her age. She lived in constant fear of the Spanish Inquisition, knowing that her visions could easily be construed as heresy or witchcraft. And indeed, after her death, some of her writings were censored and suppressed by church authorities who found them too radical or unorthodox. In many ways, Teresa's story epitomizes the paradoxes and contradictions of the Renaissance approach to mental illness. On the one hand, her experiences were celebrated as a sign of divine grace, a testament to the power of faith and the mystery of the human soul. On the other hand, they were also a source of suspicion and unease, a reminder of how easily the line between sanctity and madness could be blurred. As the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Reason in the 17th and 18th centuries, the pendulum of public opinion would continue to swing between these two poles. The rise of science and the Enlightenment would bring new insights into the workings of the mind and body, but it would also give rise to new forms of control and confinement, as the mentally ill were increasingly seen as a problem to be managed rather than a mystery to be explored. And yet, through it all, the spark of human resilience and the yearning for understanding would endure. From the haunted halls of Bedlam to the cloistered cells of the convent, the mentally ill would continue to struggle and strive, to hope and despair, to leave their mark on a world that often feared and misunderstood them. As we look back on this long and often painful history, it is easy to feel a sense of despair at the slow pace of progress, at the centuries of suffering and neglect endured by those with mental illness. But it is also an opportunity to marvel at the strength and courage of those who persevered in the face of unimaginable odds, who found meaning and purpose in their struggles, and who left behind a legacy of compassion and hope. Today, we still have much to learn about the intricacies of the mind and the nature of mental illness, but we also have the benefit of centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience, of the hard-won insights and innovations of those who came before us. From the ancient physicians who first grappled with the mysteries of the psyche, to the modern researchers who are unraveling the secrets of the brain, we are all part of a long and noble tradition of seeking to understand and alleviate the suffering of the mentally ill. It is a tradition that has been marked by ignorance and cruelty, Yes, but also by compassion and courage, by the unquenchable human desire to heal and to help. As we continue on this journey of discovery and understanding, let us draw strength from the example of those who have gone before us, who have struggled and suffered and persevered in the face of unimaginable odds. Let us honor their memory by rededicating ourselves to the task of building a world in which the mentally ill are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve, in which the dark corners of the mind are illuminated by the light of knowledge and compassion. For in the end, the story of mental illness is the story of us all, of our shared humanity, our common frailties and strengths, our unending search for meaning and connection in a world that can often seem cold and chaotic. It is a story that has been unfolding for centuries, and one that will continue to unfold for centuries to come, as long as there are those who are willing to listen and learn, to hope and to heal. So let us go forward with open hearts and open minds, ready to embrace the challenges and the opportunities of this new era in mental health. Let us build upon the hard-won progress of the past, while also daring to imagine a future in which the mentally ill are no longer relegated to the shadows, but are welcomed into the light of understanding and acceptance. It is a future that may seem distant and uncertain, but it is one that is within our grasp, if only we have the courage and the compassion to reach for it. For in the end, the measure of our progress will not be in the grand theories and technologies we devise, but in the small acts of kindness and care we extend to those who are suffering, in the quiet moments of connection and healing that remind us of our shared humanity. So let us go forth from this place of reflection and remembrance, armed with the wisdom of the past and the hope of the future. Let us be the healers and the helpers, the listeners and the learners, the ones who dare to imagine a world in which no one is left to suffer in silence and solitude. Let us be the ones who light the way forward, step by step and day by day, until the long, dark night of ignorance and fear gives way to the bright dawn of understanding and compassion. In the late medieval period, against the backdrop of raging plagues and witch trials, we find the remarkable story of Joan of Arc, the French peasant girl turned military leader and saint. Born around 1412 in Domremy, a small village in northeastern France, Joan reported experiencing vivid visions and hearing divine voices from the age of 13. These voices, which she identified as belonging to the Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, urged her to support Charles VII, the French king, and help him reclaim his throne during the 100 Years' War with England. Driven by her conviction in these revelations, Joan persistently sought an audience with Charles VII. Despite facing rejection and ridicule, she eventually gained the king's trust and was given armor and a horse. Leading French troops into battle, Joan scored a momentous victory against the English at the Siege of Orléans in 1429. Her presence boosted French morale and paved the way for Charles VII's coronation. However, Joan's triumphs were short-lived. In 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English, and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. The English clerics who presided over her trial were determined to discredit Charles VII by painting Joan as a heretic and a witch. Throughout the grueling interrogation, Joan steadfastly maintained that her visions were divinely inspired. Yet, faced with the threat of execution, she signed a confession denying the divine origin of her visions. Joan soon recanted this confession, sealing her fate. On May 30th, 1431, at the tender age of 19, Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen, her ashes scattered in the Seine River. The story of Joan of Arc raises thought-provoking questions about the boundaries between religious fervor, mental illness, and the socio-political forces that shape how these experiences are perceived and treated. Many modern scholars have speculated that Joan's visions and voices may have been symptoms of mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy, or bipolar disorder. The intense religious themes of her hallucinations, their frequent and compelling nature, and their onset in adolescence all hint at a potential underlying mental health condition. Furthermore, Jones' reported tendency to experience these visions more frequently in times of stress aligns with our current understanding of how mental illness can be exacerbated by stressful life events. However, it is crucial to approach such retroactive diagnoses with caution. The accounts of Jones' experiences are limited and colored by the religious and political contexts of her time. The very notion of mental illness as we understand it today did not exist in the Middle Ages, in an era when visions were often seen as either divinely inspired or a sign of demonic possession. Jones' experiences were inevitably viewed through this binary lens. Moreover, Jones' gender undoubtedly played a significant role in how her experiences were perceived and treated. As a young woman claiming divine authority in a fiercely patriarchal society, Joan posed a threat to the established order. Her defiance of gender norms and her donning of male attire were used against her in the trial as evidence of her supposed heresy and moral deviance. The story of Joan of Arc serves as a poignant reminder of how societal norms, religious beliefs, and political agendas can intersect to shape the way mental illness is understood and responded to. While we may never know the true nature of Joan's experiences, her tale continues to captivate and inspire, inviting us to reflect on the complex interplay between individual experience, societal expectations, and the evolving understanding of mental health across the ages. As the Middle Ages drew to a close and the Renaissance dawned, the tides of change were slowly beginning to turn in the understanding and treatment of mental illness. The revival of classical learning and the growing interest in empirical observation during the Renaissance set the stage for a gradual shift from supernatural explanations to natural ones. One notable figure at the forefront of this shift was the English scholar Robert Burton. Born in 1577, Burton spent most of his life as a vicar and a librarian at Oxford University. He is best known for his monumental work, The Anatomy of Melancholy, published in 1621. In this extensive treatise, Burton delved into the causes, symptoms, and treatments of melancholia, a condition characterized by persistent sadness, fear, and despair. Drawing upon the works of ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, as well as contemporary medical knowledge, Burton proposed that melancholia was a physical illness rooted in an imbalance of the four bodily humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. He suggested that factors such as diet, exercise, and sleep could influence these humours and thus affect one's mental state. While Burton's understanding of the precise biological mechanisms of melancholia was limited by the scientific knowledge of his time, his work represented a significant step towards a medical model of mental illness. By classifying melancholia as a medical condition rather than a spiritual affliction, Burton challenged the prevailing notion that mental illness was a result of demonic possession or divine punishment. Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy became a hugely popular and influential work, going through multiple editions and translations. It played a key role in spreading the idea that mental illness could have natural bodily causes and could potentially be treated through physical means. However, Burton's progressive ideas were not universally embraced. Many continued to adhere to supernatural explanations for mental illness, particularly in cases where the symptoms were more severe or unusual. The story of Saint Teresa of Avila, a 16th century Spanish mystic, illustrates this tension. Born into a noble family in 1515, Teresa entered a Carmelite convent at the age of 20. She soon began to experience intense spiritual visions and ecstasies, which she described in vivid detail in her writings. In one famous episode, Teresa recounted feeling as though an angel had pierced her heart with a golden spear, filling her with an overwhelming love for God. While Teresa and her contemporaries interpreted these experiences as divine revelations, some modern scholars have have suggested that they may have been symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy. This neurological condition is known to produce intense religious or spiritual experiences, as well as visual and auditory hallucinations. The case of St. Teresa highlights the enduring challenge of distinguishing between genuine religious experiences and the symptoms of mental illness. In an era when the boundaries between the two were even more blurred than they are today, such experiences were often automatically attributed to divine or demonic forces. Despite the growing recognition of natural explanations for mental illness during the Renaissance, the treatment of the mentally ill remained woefully inadequate. Asylums like Bedlam in London continued to operate more as prisons than as therapeutic institutions. Patients in these early asylums were often subjected to inhumane conditions and degrading treatment. They were chained, beaten, and put on display for the morbid amusement of paying visitors. The belief that harsh treatment could shock the mentally ill back to their senses persisted, alongside the idea that the insane were less than fully human. It would take several more centuries of scientific advancement and social reform before the treatment of the mentally ill began to resemble anything close to the standards we expect today. Nevertheless, the seeds of change were sown in the Renaissance, as scholars like Robert Burton began to challenge long-held assumptions about the nature and causes of mental illness. As we reflect on the plight of the mentally ill across the centuries, we are reminded of the deep-rooted stigma and misunderstanding that has surrounded mental illness for much of human history. From the supernatural explanations of the medieval era to the harsh treatments of the early modern period, the mentally ill have long been marginalized, misunderstood, and mistreated. Yet there is cause for hope. The gradual shift towards a medical understanding of mental illness that began in the Renaissance laid the groundwork for the development of more humane and effective treatments in the centuries that followed. Today, while stigma and challenges certainly remain, we have a greater understanding of the complex biological, psychological, and social factors that contribute to mental health and illness. As we look to the future, it is crucial that we continue to build upon this progress. By investing in mental health research, improving access to care, and working to dismantle the stigma that still surrounds mental illness, we can create a world in which those who struggle with mental health challenges are met with compassion, understanding, and effective support. The stories of those who suffered in the past, the unnamed multitudes confined to asylums, the visionaries like Joan of Arc and Saint Teresa, whose experiences were misunderstood, the countless individuals who bore their struggles in silence, serve as a poignant reminder of the work that still lies ahead. In the quiet of the night, as we reflect on these stories, let us hold space for the suffering of the past and the present. Let us dream of a future in which mental health is prioritized as an essential part of overall well-being, and in which no one must face the challenges of mental illness alone. The journey has been long, and the road ahead may be longer still, but with compassion, knowledge, and unwavering commitment, a brighter future is within our reach. We now turn our attention to the late Middle Ages, a turbulent time marked by plague, famine, and religious fervor. The 14th and 15th centuries saw the devastating spread of the Black Death across Europe, wiping out a third of the population. In the midst of this chaos and despair, mass hysteria erupted in the form of witch hunts. The mentally ill, with their unusual behavior and disturbed minds, were convenient scapegoats caught in the crossfire. At the time, mental illness was still widely believed to be caused by demonic possession or witchcraft. Those exhibiting signs of madness, from melancholia to mania, were accused of being in league with the devil himself. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, codified the identification and persecution of alleged witches, including methods of interrogation and torture. Many mentally ill individuals confessed under duress to all manner of devilry and were summarily executed. One of the most famous figures tried as a heretic during this period was Joan of Arc, the young French peasant girl turned military leader. Guided by divine visions and voices, Joan led the French army to several crucial victories in the 100 Years' War against England. However, her claims of direct communication with God and her habit of wearing men's clothing made her a target of the Inquisition. Captured by the enemy Burgundians and handed over to the English, Joan was put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. Her visions were used as evidence of demonic influence, though today, some scholars believe she may have been experiencing symptoms of schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. Found guilty, Joan was sentenced to death and burned at the stake in 1431 at the age of just 19. It would be nearly 500 years before she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. While accusations of witchcraft spelled a grim fate for many mentally ill individuals, some found themselves confined to a different kind of hell, the asylum. The concept of institutionalizing the mentally ill began to take root in the late Middle Ages, with the founding of places like the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, better known by its nickname Bedlam. Established in 1247 as a priory, Bedlam was converted into a hospital for the mentally ill in 1407. It would gain a notorious reputation as a human zoo, where patients were kept in wretched conditions and put on display for the morbid amusement of paying visitors. Inmates were chained, beaten, and left to wallow in their own filth. Treatment, if it could be called that, consisted of purges, bloodletting, and experimental surgeries. Bedlam set the stage for the bleak institutional model of mental health care that would persist for centuries to come. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, winds of change began to blow through the cobwebbed halls of medieval thought. The 15th through 17th centuries saw a renewed interest in science and the rediscovery of ancient texts by physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. Slowly but surely, supernatural explanations for mental illness began to yield ground to natural ones. One influential figure in this philosophical shift was English scholar Robert Burton. In his 1621 tome, The Anatomy of Melancholy, Burton departed from the old dogmas and argued that melancholia was a medical condition arising from imbalances in the body's humours, rather than a spiritual affliction. He described the symptoms of depression with remarkable insight and even proposed some rudimentary treatments like diet, exercise, and herbal remedies. Burton drew upon the works of ancient physicians, but also contemporary accounts of melancholy, such as the case of Spanish mystic Saint Teresa of Avila. Teresa experienced vivid visions and ecstatic states, which she attributed to divine rapture. She described feeling transported to heaven and even levitating during prayer. While some of her contemporaries accused her of being possessed, she was eventually canonized as a saint. Modern scholars have suggested that Teresa's visions may have been a result of temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition known to produce intense spiritual experiences. Despite the gradual evolution of thought surrounding mental illness, the treatment of the mentally ill saw little improvement in practice. Asylums like Bedlam continued to warehouse patients in abysmal conditions well into the modern era. Scenes of naked, raving lunatics in chains, left to fester in dirty straw, remained commonplace. It's a disturbing picture to contemplate, one that stands in stark contrast to the relative enlightenment of the Renaissance. But change, however slow and uneven, was on the horizon. The seeds had been planted for a more humane view of mental illness, even if it would take centuries for them to fully blossom. From the shadows of superstition and cruelty, a light of compassion and understanding would eventually emerge. But much suffering would be endured along the way. As we reflect on this dark chapter in the history of mental health care, it's easy to feel a sense of despair at the ignorance and callousness of our ancestors. But we must also remember how far we've come since then. The mentally ill are no longer burned as witches or left to rot in dungeons. We have therapies and medications that can ease their suffering and even help them lead fulfilling lives. And yet, the stigma persists, and many still struggle to get the care they need. In a way, the plight of the mentally ill in medieval times is a reminder of the work that remains to be done, the long road we still have to travel to create a world of true compassion and dignity for all. It's a journey that began centuries ago, with the first brave souls who dared to question the old superstitions and see the humanity in those society had cast aside. And it's a journey that continues today, with each of us called to play our parts in building a more just and caring world. So, as we close the book on this grim chapter of history, let us not despair, but rather draw strength from how far we've come and how much further we can still go. The mentally ill may have suffered in the shadows of the Middle Ages, but their story is not over yet. It's up to us to write the next chapter, one of hope, healing, and light. As the medieval period progressed into the Renaissance, the winds of change slowly began to blow through the musty corridors of asylums like Bethlehem Hospital. While conditions remained grim for the mentally ill languishing in these squalid institutions, glimmers of light were starting to peek through the cracks in the edifice of medieval thinking. The works of ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, long lost to the Western world, were rediscovered and studied with renewed fervour by Renaissance scholars. They pored over the yellowed pages, their eyes lighting up at the idea that mental illness could have natural biological causes rather than supernatural ones. It was a radical notion for the time, a departure from centuries of dogma that had attributed conditions like melancholia and mania to demonic possession or divine punishment. One of the most influential thinkers of this era was an English scholar by the name of Robert Burton. A man of the cloth with a keen analytical mind, Burton spent much of his life grappling with the age-old question of why some people descended into states of profound sadness and despair. In his magnum opus, a weighty tome titled The Anatomy of Melancholy, he meticulously catalogued the various forms and manifestations of what we now know as depression. With a quill in hand and a glint in his eye, Burton argued that melancholia was not a spiritual affliction, but a medical condition rooted in an imbalance of the body's four humours: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. It was a theory that harkened back to the teachings of Hippocrates, who had proposed a similar idea nearly 2,000 years earlier. Though Burton's hypothesis would eventually be disproven, his work represented a crucial turning point in the understanding of mental illness. By framing melancholia as a physical ailment rather than a moral failing, he helped to chip away at the stigma that had long surrounded those who suffered from it. Slowly, but surely, the idea that the mentally ill were not possessed by demons or cursed by God began to take hold in the minds of forward-thinking physicians and philosophers. But old habits die hard, and for many, the notion of mental illness as a supernatural phenomenon persisted well into the Renaissance. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the case of Saint Teresa of Avila, a Spanish nun who lived in the 16th century. From a young age, Teresa experienced vivid, ecstatic visions that she believed were direct communications from God. She would often fall into trances, her body writhing and convulsing, as she claimed to feel the divine presence coursing through her veins. To the church authorities of the time, Teresa's experiences were nothing short of miraculous. They held her up as a paragon of piety, a living saint whose visions were a testament to the power of faith. But to modern psychiatrists, Teresa's symptoms bear a striking resemblance to those of temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition that can cause hallucinations, déjà vu, and feelings of intense religious or spiritual significance. Of course, Teresa was far from the only religious figure to be posthumously diagnosed with a mental illness. From Joan of Arc to Martin Luther, history is littered with examples of individuals whose seemingly divine experiences may have had a more earthly explanation. But in Teresa's case, the contrast between the medieval and modern understandings of her condition is particularly stark. In the centuries since her death, Teresa has been canonized as a saint, her visions and ecstasies held up as proof of her unshakable devotion to God. But seen through the lens of modern psychiatry, her story takes on a different hue. It becomes a tragic tale of a brilliant, passionate woman whose suffering was misunderstood and even celebrated by those around her. As the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Enlightenment, the tide of public opinion continued to turn against the old, superstitious ideas about mental illness. But change was slow to come to the asylums and hospitals where the mentally ill were confined. At places like Bethlehem Hospital, patients were still being chained to walls, beaten with rods, and put on display like animals in a menagerie. It would take centuries of advocacy and reform to begin to dismantle the brutal system of institutionalization that had its roots in the medieval era. And even today, the stigma and misunderstanding surrounding mental illness persists in many corners of society. But as we look back on the long, troubled history of how the mentally ill have been treated, we can take some small measure of comfort in the knowledge that progress, however halting and uneven, has been made. From the exorcisms and bloodletting of the Middle Ages to the humane, evidence-based treatments of the modern era, the story of mental illness is one of slow but steady progress. It is a reminder that even the most entrenched beliefs and practices can be overturned by the relentless march of science and reason. And it is a testament to the resilience and courage of those who have struggled with mental illness throughout the ages, often in the face of unspeakable cruelty and ignorance. As we reflect on this history, let us not forget the countless lives that were lost or ruined by the failings of those who came before us. Let us honor their memory by continuing to fight for a world in which all people, regardless of their mental health status, are treated with the dignity, compassion, and respect that they deserve. For in the end, the measure of a society is not in how it treats its most fortunate members, but in how it cares for its most vulnerable. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us hold fast to the hope that the future will be a brighter one for those who suffer from mental illness. Let us dream of a world in which the demons of ignorance and fear have been banished to the shadows, and in which the light of understanding and acceptance shines forth like a beacon in the night. For only then will we truly be able to say that we have learned the lessons of the past, and only then will we be able to build a better, kinder world for all who inhabit it. As the Renaissance dawned across Europe in the 15th century, the old medieval order began to crumble. The Black Death had swept away nearly half the population. The Catholic Church's ironclad grip on power started to slip, and a new spirit of inquiry and individualism stirred. For centuries, the mentally ill had languished in a purgatory on earth, cast out, chained up, condemned as witches, trapped in their own minds with little hope of reprieve. But as the Renaissance unfolded, winds of change rustled through musty monasteries and cloistered asylum halls. It began with a book. The flowering of Renaissance humanism rekindled an interest in classical texts, the yellowed scrolls and faded codices of antiquity. Monks and scholars dusted off the long-neglected works of ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, poring over them by flickering candlelight. The ancients, they discovered, had held a startlingly different view of mental illness. Not as demonic possession or divine scourge, but as a natural disease of the mind and body. The Greek physician Hippocrates had proposed that an imbalance of 4 essential humours, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, could throw both mind and body into disorder. Galen, in the 2nd century AD, had located the origins of mental disturbance in the brain itself, not the ethereal soul. These musings, radical in their time, planted seeds of doubt in Renaissance minds. Could mental illness be a medical condition, treatable like any other malady? One man who took these ideas to heart was English scholar Robert Burton. Tucked away in the hushed halls of Oxford, Burton immersed himself in the study of melancholia, what we might call depression. Poetic streaks of melancholy had long been romanticized as the burden of great men. But Burton saw it as a true sickness, an affliction of natural origins. In 1621, Burton published his masterwork, The Anatomy of Melancholy. Across a sprawling tome of some 500,000 words, Burton catalogued the varied shades of melancholia with encyclopedic zeal. He described its telltale signs with the eye of a natural philosopher. A most grievous and tedious disease, Burton wrote, an intolerable anguish of the soul, a quintessence of hellish torture. Its sufferers were plagued by suspicion, doubt, fear, sorrow, furies, cares, anxiety. They shunned company and pined away, captive to their own darkened thoughts. Burton cited medical men both ancient and modern, from Hippocrates to Avicenna, the 11th century Persian physician who had linked melancholia to an excess of black bile. But Burton went further. With a slyly satirical eye, he rooted the causes of melancholy in the follies and vices of the age. Love melancholy arose from pining after an elusive paramour, religious melancholy from excessive fear of damnation. Political melancholy struck courtiers vying for prestige. Scholars, like Burton himself, were prone to a bookish strain from too much study and solitude. Beneath Burton's wit lay a truth that had eluded the sages of old. Melancholia, in all its tangled forms, was an affliction both of individual temperament and of the times. Diet, exercise, bloodletting, even music could bring relief to a mind unmoored. But the tumult of an age in upheaval, of clashing faiths and overturned hierarchies, left countless souls adrift. Still, old beliefs died hard. Across Europe, cries of demonic possession and witchcraft still rang out, sending many a troubled mind to the stake or gallows. One woman caught in this maelstrom was Teresa of Avila, a nun in 16th century Spain, gripped by ecstatic visions. In the throes of her episodes, Teresa would fall into deep trances, oblivious to all around her. She claimed to commune with God, even to levitate before the crucifix. But there were whispers too, of the devil's hand at work. Her superiors, fearing scandal, subjected Teresa to humiliating tests, exorcisms, interrogations, commands to perform her raptures on cue. But she emerged unscathed and revered. In time, the Church beatified her as a saint. Today, some suspect Teresa may have suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to trigger intense spiritual experiences. In her own time, she walked a razor's edge between holy woman and heretic, salvation and damnation. Saints and mystics, like the mentally ill, had long occupied a liminal space in the medieval world. Touched by the divine or bedeviled by demons, set apart from the sane and pious. While Burton and his fellow scholars chipped away at the old superstitions, seeing glimmers of nature behind the supernatural, most Renaissance minds remained mired between the two. Even in enlightened asylums like the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, that infamous London edifice of abuse popularly known as Bedlam, mental illness remained a mark of moral weakness, a taint to be scoured away through confinement and cruelty. Well into the age of reason, neighbours still flocked to Bedlam to gawk at the mad poor, a tuppence granting entry to a human zoo. There they jeered as inmates howled and paced, rattling like ghosts in their chains. All sins and afflictions laid bare, all dignity stripped away. It's a far cry from the paintings of the Renaissance masters, all serenity and light. But Bedlam, as much as Botticelli, is the face of an age when the old order splintered and the human mind itself became a battleground. As the last strains of the Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment, the plight of the mentally ill stood at a crossroads. Science and reason would march on, but hearts and minds trailed behind. A few flares of insight, like Burton's tome, lit the path ahead to a more humane understanding. But it would take centuries more for the links between mind, body, and society to be truly understood, and longer still for compassion to conquer fear. The cries of Bedlam would echo across the ages, a reminder of how far we still had to go. From the Renaissance to our own time, the mentally ill walk among us in all their flawed and fragile humanity. Their minds, in the end, are not so different from our own, miracles and mysteries of nature, even in their darkest compulsions. May we meet them not with judgment, but with empathy. Fellow travelers in the dance of madness and reason we call the human condition. The stagnant waters of the Thames flowed sluggishly past the walls of Bethlem Royal Hospital, as if even the river was too weary and dejected to summon any sense of urgency. Founded in 1247, it was originally the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem, intended to serve as a centre of healing and respite. But over the centuries, the hospital's purpose had warped into something very different. By the late 1500s, it had become known simply as Bedlam, and for good reason. Behind Bethlem's cold stone walls, a tableau of misery played out, day after wretched day. The hospital was now exclusively dedicated to the care of the insane, but care is really far too kind a word to describe what went on there. The hapless patients, men and women suffering from every form of mental disturbance and distress, lived out their days in abhorrent squalor. They lay on straw-covered floors in dank cells, shackled to the walls with iron chains. The corridors echoed with howls and wails as the desperate patients cried out in anguish. Bethlem was not a place of treatment or recovery. It was a place to dispose of society's unwanted, a dumping ground where the mentally ill could be locked away out of sight. The patients were regarded as little more than animals. The cruel treatments inflicted upon them were designed more to subdue and punish than to heal. Unruly patients were whipped and beaten into submission. The disruptive were plunged into ice-cold baths to jolt them into obedience. All the while, the patients languished in their own bodily filth, wallowing in a morass of physical and mental torment. Shockingly, this house of horrors became a form of public entertainment in the 17th century. For the price of just 1 penny, Londoners could roam the fetid hallways of Bethlem to gawk and jeer at the poor souls held within. The patients were put on display, like carnival freaks, for the morbid amusement of the gawking masses, those inmates who hurled themselves against the bars in fits of mania or raved incoherently provided the most sport for the snickering spectators. It's a tragic irony that a place ostensibly dedicated to healing and Christian charity could devolve into such a theatre of cruelty. But in many ways, Bethlem was simply a reflection of prevailing societal attitudes towards the mentally ill in the late medieval and early modern period. The patients within its walls were seen as little more than human refuse. Their irrational behaviour and inner torments were viewed as evidence that they had surrendered to evil or offended God in some unforgivable way. To the medieval mind, madness was a spiritual affliction, not a medical condition requiring care and compassion. Of course, some rare souls did advocate for more humane treatment of the insane during this period. In 1426, London's Court of Aldermen ordered that the poor madmen of Bedlam be provided with food, drink, and a fire for warmth. But such gestures of basic human decency were few and far between. The prevailing treatment for madness in Bethlem and other early insane asylums remained abuse and neglect. It would be comforting to imagine that places like Bedlam were horrific aberrations. But the truth is, The wretched scenes that played out behind its walls were all too representative of the plight of the mentally ill in medieval times. From London to Paris to Rome, those suffering from mental afflictions were regarded with revulsion and dread. They were whipped, chained, starved, and locked away to endure their private agonies alone and forgotten. Change would come excruciatingly slowly over the centuries that followed. A few lone voices in the wilderness, men like the Swiss physician Paracelsus and the philosopher Desiderius Erasmus, began to argue that the mad were not evil, but sick, and deserved care rather than condemnation. Paracelsus wrote movingly of the plight of the insane, urging his fellow physicians to not condemn or laugh at these unfortunate people, for they are facing the wrath of God in a special manner and, therefore, need and deserve our help. But these seeds of compassion and understanding would take centuries to truly take root. In the meantime, untold multitudes of mentally ill men, women, and children would continue to suffer in miserable silence, hidden away in dank cells and dismal asylums across Europe. Their anguished cries echoed off cold stone walls, unheard and unheeded by a society that regarded them as something less than human. It's sobering to consider the depths of callousness and cruelty to which we can descend in our treatment of the most vulnerable among us. How easy it is to demonize those who are different, those whose minds and spirits are shattered in ways we find strange and disturbing. The tragic history of how the mentally ill were regarded in medieval times reminds us of the vital importance of empathy and compassion. It's a clarion call to see the humanity in even the most tormented souls. There is, after all, a frighteningly thin line that separates us from them, the allegedly sane from the allegedly mad. The patients who suffered in Bedlam endured the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that can assail any mind, any life. But for the grace of chance and circumstance, their private hells could be any one of ours. In the depths of their despair, they deserved not judgment, but mercy. In their brokenness, they needed not a wagging finger, but an outstretched hand. If we can take any lesson from their sorrowful stories, let it be that there is no them, only us, only fragile, fallible, precious human beings, doing our best to find some light amidst the darkness of this world. As the grip of dogma and superstition slowly loosened in the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered the ancient works of physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. A renewed spirit of scientific inquiry began to cast mental illness in a new light. Rather than defaulting to supernatural explanations, some thinkers started to examine the natural causes behind disorders of the mind. One such man was Robert Burton, a 17th century English scholar and clergyman. In his weighty tome, The Anatomy of Melancholy, published in 1621, Burton meticulously catalogued the various manifestations and origins of what we now call depression. Drawing upon the humoral theory of Hippocrates, Burton argued that an excess of black bile was to blame for the brooding despair of melancholy. While his theory missed the mark, Burton's work represented an important step. By classifying melancholy as a medical condition rather than a spiritual affliction, he helped to inch the conversation in a new direction. But old beliefs died hard. Ironically, Burton himself subscribed to the notion that demons could still play a hand in mental disturbances. It would take many generations for the influence of religion and superstition to fully fade from the discourse around mental health. In the meantime, the plight of those branded as witches, heretics, or lunatics remained grim. Consider the case of Saint Teresa of Avila, the 16th century Spanish mystic and nun. From childhood, Teresa experienced vivid spiritual visions and raptures. In her writings, she recounted intense episodes of religious ecstasy, describing out-of-body experiences and a sense of being physically pierced by God's love. While her mystical encounters earned her sainthood, to a modern eye, they bear the hallmarks of temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to trigger hyper-religious feelings and hallucinations. In Teresa's time, however, her altered states of consciousness were interpreted through a purely theological lens. She lived in constant anxiety that her trances were the work of the devil, not divine communion. Her visions were scrutinized by the Inquisition, the Catholic Church's notorious heretic hunting tribunal. Fortunately for Teresa, she was a savvy political operator, securing powerful patrons and allaying suspicions about her orthodoxy. But others experiencing similar neurological events were not so lucky, ending up condemned as demoniacs or dragged away to asylums. And what awaited the mentally ill consigned to grim institutions like Bethlem Royal Hospital, the infamous London asylum better known as Bedlam? Despite the lofty aspirations of its founders, the reality inside Bedlam's walls was anything but therapeutic. The squalid conditions and callous attitudes that characterized other early asylums across Europe were magnified in Bedlam to grotesque proportions. Patients, many of them poor souls rounded up from the streets, were crammed into dank, filthy cells. Crowded together without adequate food, clothing, or heat, they languished in their own waste, ripe for disease outbreaks. Seen as little more than human refuse, the inhabitants of Bedlam were at the mercy of a staff free to neglect and abuse with impunity. Shrieks of terror and anguish echoed down the fetid corridors. It was a scene straight out of Dante's Inferno. Believe it or not, the misery of Bedlam's unfortunate residents was further compounded by a practice that to modern sensibilities seems unimaginably cruel: the opening of the asylum doors to the paying public. For a penny, visitors could stroll through the wards and ogle the patients as though they were zoo animals. Fashionable aristocratic ladies and curious middle-class gawkers alike amused themselves by taunting and provoking the agitated denizens within. The freak show atmosphere turned the mentally ill into objects of morbid titillation and sport. Human dignity was checked at the gates. If the Renaissance represented a step forward in the philosophical conception of mental illness, then places like Bedlam revealed how far there was still to go in society's treatment of the most vulnerable. The light of scientific rationality may have begun to creep in, but for those trapped in the shadowlands of afflicted minds, there was yet little refuge or relief. Like the ship of fools in Renaissance art, boats filled with the deranged and set adrift, the mentally ill remained cast out, marginalized, and at the mercy of prevailing winds. As we sail on through history, it's worth pausing to consider the wider implications of this story. The mentally ill served, and in many ways continue to serve, as a mirror for society's fears, prejudices, and blind spots. How a culture treats those with psychiatric disorders speaks volumes about its deepest values and character. The road from demonization to compassion, from shunning to integration, has been a long and winding one. There's no straight line from the exorcisms of the Middle Ages to the biological psychiatry of today. And it's a journey we're still on. While leaps in neuroscience and pharmacology have immensely improved quality of life for many, the stigma around mental illness is a stubborn holdover. Funding for research and treatment perpetually lags behind other areas of medicine. In parts of the developing world, misguided traditional beliefs in sorcery and spiritual possession still linger. Even in the modern West, our system of care has gaping holes, with jails and streets serving as de facto asylums. So as we reflect on how far we've come from the days of Bedlam, let's not be lulled into complacency. The ethical imperative to do right by some of society's most defenseless members remains as urgent as ever. By staring back into history's funhouse mirrors, we remind ourselves of what's distorted in our own time. Because the story of mental illness is ultimately the story of who we are and who we aspire to be. The towering spires of grand cathedrals pierce the skies over medieval Europe, their shadows stretching across cobblestone streets and bustling markets. In this world steeped in faith and superstition, mental illness was a perplexing and fearsome phenomenon. Those afflicted were often seen as cursed, possessed by demons, or punished by a wrathful God. Their fates were tragic, and their treatment woefully misguided by modern standards. One such soul was Marjorie Kemp, a remarkable Englishwoman who lived in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Born into a prominent family in the bustling port town of King's Lynn, Marjorie's early life followed the conventional path for a woman of her station. She married young, bore 14 children, and helped run her husband's businesses. But beneath the veneer of domestic normalcy, Marjorie's mind was in tumult. Around the age of 20, after the birth of her first child, Marjorie was gripped by a mysterious illness. She grew frantic and despondent, convinced she was damned to hell for her sins. In her distress, Marjorie claimed to experience a transformative vision of Jesus Christ, who appeared at her bedside and comforted her. This mystical episode marked a turning point in Marjorie's life, the beginning of an unconventional spiritual journey that would bring her both reverence and revulsion. Marjorie's visions grew more frequent and intense. She wept copiously for the suffering of Christ, roared with laughter at the promise of divine love, and engaged in ecstatic conversations with God that could last for days. To outward observers in a deeply pious but superstitious age, Marjorie's behavior appeared bizarre and disruptive. Many labeled her a madwoman, a heretic, or a fraud. Undeterred, Marjorie embarked on pilgrimages across England and Europe, from Canterbury to Jerusalem, all while draped in white robes, in emulation of a virgin bride of Christ. She allegedly had the miraculous ability to smell sin, and frequently wailed or screamed in the presence of those she intuited to be wicked, much to their chagrin. Marjorie's own priestly scribe wrote of her with a mix of awe and exasperation, describing a woman who could be by turns gentle and wrathful, humble and vainglorious. Church authorities interrogated Marjorie numerous times on suspicion of Lollody, a heretical reform movement, but she always argued her way out of trouble. Some clergy found her piety inspiring, while others denounced her as possessed. Marjorie's insistence on dressing in white, reserving such privileges normally allowed only for virgin women, provoked particular outrage. How much of Marjorie's unusual conduct sprang from sincere religious devotion, and how much from what we would now call mental illness, is impossible to disentangle. Some modern scholars believe she may have suffered from a form of epilepsy or schizophrenia. The Book of Marjorie Kempe, dictated to scribes as possibly the first autobiography in the English language, recounts her spiritual highs and lows in vivid detail, a window into both medieval mysticism and neurodivergence. In an age when the mad were believed to be tainted by the devil, Marjorie was fortunate to escape the worst fates that could befall the mentally ill. She was never confined to a dank prison cell or asylum, subjected to exorcisms or torturous treatments. Her status, forceful personality, and knack for scriptural argument were perhaps a saving grace. Many others were not so lucky. The lepers, beggars, and vagrants who roamed medieval Europe often included those we would now consider mentally ill: schizophrenics, depressives, and sufferers of PTSD in a war-torn land. With no concept of psychiatric care, their conditions were left to fester until their minds fractured and they ran afoul of authorities or social norms. Their options were bleak: the stocks and scaffolds, dank dungeon cells, or squalid buildings on the outskirts of towns that served to confine the diseased and deranged. As the Middle Ages progressed, a few forward-thinking saints and scholars inched the needle towards a more medicalized view of mental illness. Persian polymath Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna, theorized that melancholia arose from an imbalance of humors in the brain that could potentially be treated with baths, music, and aromatics. But such proto-psychiatric musings were a minority view in a society that still cleaved to the supernatural as the cause for all manners of madness. More often, mental illness was conflated with demonic possession, witchcraft, or devilry, especially in women. A mad woman was not just ill, but evil, a dangerous agent of Satan that had to be restrained or eliminated. Across Europe, witch trials ensnared countless mentally ill women and men, from delusional schizophrenics to senile grandmothers, alongside the perfectly sane who had the misfortune to be disliked by the wrong people. The notorious witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries had their theological roots in the medieval era. Influential texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, codified the supposed signs of witchery, many of which resemble symptoms of psychosis, mania, or delusion. Eccentric village healers, herb women, the homeless, and marginalized mad made prime targets in a fevered hunt for servants of the devil. In this dangerous climate, many mentally ill people met horrific ends, burned at the stake, hanged, drowned, or locked away to endure squalor and abuse. The quiet suffering of the mad was drowned out by the roar of the witch trial crowds, baying for blood. Mental illness was a mark of evil, not a sickness to be treated with care. And yet, there were rare rays of hope and compassion in this dark age. Some monasteries took in mentally ill penitents, offering rudimentary care, a roof over their heads, and a respite from the torments of the outside world. Certain saints, like Dymphna of Ireland, came to be associated with the protection of the mad and melancholic. Supplicants would undertake pilgrimages to the shrines of these saints in hope of a miraculous cure. Holy wells were ascribed healing powers for troubled minds. Herbal concoctions and blessed oils were administered to restore the balance of humours. Such faith-based remedies were a far cry from modern psychiatry, but they offered a path of hope, however faint, in a world with few options for the mentally ill. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, some of the old superstitions surrounding mental illness began to erode. Scholars and proto-scientists like Robert Burton, who penned the 1621 tome The Anatomy of Melancholy, helped reconceptualize conditions like depression as natural ailments rather than supernatural afflictions. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman medical texts provided alternatives to the religious lens of medieval Europe. But progress was slow and fitful. Bedlam Hospital, founded in 1247 as a dedicated institution for the mentally ill, persisted as a squalid horror show where patients were more likely to be beaten and chained than treated with any semblance of dignity. Gawkers would pay a penny to roam the fetid halls and laugh at the antics of the deranged. The road from medieval madhouse to modern psychiatric care would be a long and winding one. Still, we can look back across the centuries with empathy for the mentally ill of the Middle Ages, so profoundly misunderstood by the societies in which they moved. Marjorie Kemp and her hidden kindred spirits, mystics and madfolk, visionaries and psychotics, bore their inner torments in a world ill-equipped to ease their pain. Some, through fortune or force of will, managed to navigate their difficult path with a modicum of grace. But too many were demonized, ostracized, abused, or discarded, their suffering unrecognized, their humanity denied. In remembering their stories, we recognize how far we've come in our understanding of the mind, and how far we've yet to go to build a world that treats all people in all states of consciousness with the compassion they deserve. The mentally ill of medieval Europe cry out to us from the past, urging us to see them not as witches or demons, but as fellow travelers in the timeless struggle to make sense of the wondrous and terrifying workings of the human brain. The somber fate of the mentally ill incarcerated in asylums like Bedlam continued into the Renaissance period, despite the shifting winds of how mental illness was understood. As the works of ancient physicians were rediscovered and a revival of scientific inquiry began to dawn, there was a gradual turning of the tide from supernatural explanations for madness to natural ones. Leading thinkers of the time, while still steeped in medieval ideas, began to ponder the physical causes and treatments for mental afflictions. The 16th century Swiss physician Paracelsus postulated that mental disturbances arose not from demonic possession, but from a chemical imbalance in the brain. Drawing upon the humoral theory of Hippocrates and Galen, he proposed remedies to correct this imbalance and restore the natural harmony of the mind and body. In 1621, the English scholar Robert Burton published his magnum opus, The Anatomy of Melancholy, in which he meticulously classified what we now call depression as a medical condition with myriad causes, symptoms, and cures. With an incisive wit, Burton wrote, "Melancholy, the subject of our present discourse, is either indisposition or habit. Indisposition is that transitory melancholy which goes and comes upon every small occasion of sorrow, need, sickness, trouble, fear, grief, passion, or perturbation of the mind, any manner of care, discontent, or thought. This melancholy of which we are to treat is a habit, a serious ailment, a settled humour, as Aurelianus and others call it, not errant, but fixed." Burton's work marked an important shift in the conception of melancholia from a fleeting temperament to a medical disorder. He advised a holistic regimen of diet, exercise, herbal tonics, purgatives, bloodletting, and even music therapy to alleviate the symptoms of melancholy. While some of his cures may seem quaint or misguided by modern standards, Burton's comprehensive approach recognized the complex interplay of mind and body in mental illness. Despite these nascent medical insights, the treatment of the mentally ill in asylums remained largely unchanged. The infamous Bethlehem Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam, was founded in London in 1247 and began admitting the mentally ill in the late 14th century. By the 17th century, Bedlam had become a notorious spectacle, where for a penny, visitors could gawk at the raving lunatics chained to the walls. The dehumanizing conditions were vividly depicted by the playwright Thomas Dekker, who in 1604 described the poor souls that here in Bedlam dwell, with unwashed faces and tattered garments, all bedusted and besmeared. For the average Londoner, a visit to Bedlam was a source of cheap entertainment and a way to reinforce the social hierarchy. The lunatics served as a cautionary tale of what could befall those who strayed from the path of reason and respectability. The cruel irony was that the very conditions of Bedlam, the filth, the chains, the lack of proper care, likely exacerbated the mental distress of its residents. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts, where the neglect and abuse of the mentally ill only served to confirm the prejudices against them. Amidst the squalor of Bedlam, there were occasional glimmers of humanity. The Elizabethan poet Richard Brackenbury was sent to Bedlam in 1586 for lunatic demeanour. During his confinement, he scratched verses into the walls of his cell with a key, expressing his anguish and pleading for mercy. "A Bedlam is my home," he wrote. "A keeper is my mate, from whence I dare not roam, lest they do shut their gate." Brackenbury's poignant words are a reminder that beneath the facade of madness, there were real people suffering in Bedlam and other asylums of the era. Their plight was a reflection of a society that had not yet developed the empathy or understanding to properly care for those with mental illness. As the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Enlightenment, there was a gradual shift towards more humane treatment of the mentally ill. In 1656, the French asylum director Louis XIV decreed that inmates should be unchained and allowed to move freely about the hospital grounds. He also instituted occupational therapy, encouraging patients to engage in work and leisure activities to promote their recovery. This marked the beginning of what would come to be known as moral treatment, a therapeutic approach based on kindness, respect, and occupational engagement. Over the next 2 centuries, reformers like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England would champion moral treatment and transform the asylum from a place of punishment to a place of healing. But progress was slow and uneven. For every enlightened asylum, there were dozens more that continued to operate in the old ways, with patients confined in squalid cells, and subjected to harsh restraints and punishments. And even in the most progressive institutions, mental illness was still deeply misunderstood and stigmatized. It would take hundreds of years and countless people struggling for change to get us to where we are today. We now know that mental illness has biological, psychological, and social causes. We have diagnostic systems, evidence-based therapies, and medications to alleviate symptoms. We've come to see those with mental illness not as raving lunatics or sinful deviants, but as human beings deserving of dignity, care, and respect. Yet the shadows of the past still linger. Mental illness continues to be stigmatized and misunderstood. Too many people still lack access to proper treatment and support. While asylums are a thing of the bygone era, people with serious mental illness are disproportionately represented in our prisons and homeless populations, echoing the neglect and mistreatment of centuries past. As we reflect on how far we've come in our understanding and treatment of mental illness, we must also reckon with how much further we still have to go. The story of mental illness is ultimately a story about our humanity, our capacity for both cruelty and compassion. It's a reminder that how we treat the most vulnerable among us is a measure of our progress as a society. So let us take inspiration from the reformers and advocates who fought to change the status quo. Let us learn from the missteps and injustices of the past, and let us work towards a future where everyone who struggles with their mental health is met with understanding, acceptance, and the support they need to live full and dignified lives. The road ahead may be long, but if history has taught us anything, it's that change is possible when we have the courage to imagine a different way. As we've seen, the treatment of the mentally ill in medieval times was a complicated tapestry woven from strands of superstition, spirituality, and the slow march of science. While some, like Avicenna and Robert Burton, sought to understand mental illness through a medical lens, the prevailing beliefs of the time meant that many sufferers were viewed as possessed by demons or punished by God. Those beliefs had tragic consequences for countless individuals. We need look no further than the harrowing story of Joan of Arc, the young French warrior and mystic who was tried as a heretic and burned at the stake. Today, many scholars believe Joan may have experienced schizophrenia or another mental illness that manifested as divine visions and voices. But in her time, Joan's experiences were interpreted as evidence of witchcraft and collusion with the devil himself. Joan was far from alone in facing persecution for her inner battles. As witch hunts swept across Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, the mentally ill were frequent targets, accused of consorting with dark powers. It's a chilling reminder of how our lack of understanding can breed fear and cruelty towards those who are different or struggling. Even as a medical view of mental illness gradually took root in the Renaissance, the treatment of patients remained abysmal. The notorious Bethlehem Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam, was emblematic of the squalid conditions in early asylums. Patients were confined in cramped, filthy cells, often chained and beaten. Cruelly, they were even put on display as entertainment for paying gawkers who viewed their torment as a curiosity. It would be comforting to imagine that the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment brought a kinder, gentler approach to mental health care. But the sad reality is that the mentally ill would continue to languish in institutions more akin to prisons than places of healing for centuries to come. While the work of early psychiatrists and reformers like Philippe Pinel in the late 1700s sowed the seeds of more humane treatment, asylums remained grim warehouses for society's outcasts well into the 20th century. As we come to the end of our journey through this overlooked corner of history, it's worth reflecting on how far we've come in our understanding of the mind and its maladies. The demons and witchcraft of the medieval imagination have given way to neuroscience and psychiatry medication, and therapy. And yet, the stigma around mental illness stubbornly persists, a remnant of the old beliefs that viewing suffering as a moral failing. Perhaps by shining a light on this history, we can cultivate the empathy and compassion that was so scarce in the past. By recognizing the humanity of those who struggle with mental illness, both in ages gone by and in our own time, we can chip away at the fear and judgment that have caused so much pain. It's a reminder that how we treat the most vulnerable among us is a measure of our progress as a society. As we close the book on this chapter of history, I invite you to carry its lessons with you. When you encounter someone grappling with mental health challenges, respond with the understanding and grace that was so sorely lacking in medieval times. And as you drift off to sleep, let your dreams imagine a world where no one need suffer alone in the dark. If you found this foray into the forgotten corners of history enlightening, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more fascinating tales to uncover and ponder together. Until next time, sweet dreams and good night.